You have some salespeople, and then you have a product team. And sometimes those two groups don't mesh in a way that's meaningful. I think it's really important you start to figure out how to separate signal from noise. A team like ours, we are a global team, right? And so we are that point, that aggregation point, if you will, between all the stuff the salespeople hear about and all the stuff they think is, their customer wants this and this customer wants this, and they say they need this. Well, have we heard that before? Are we starting to pick up signal?
This is All Quiet on the Second Front, a podcast where boring conversations around defense tech and national security come to die. Join me, Tyler Sweatt, and my Second Front comrades as we dismantle the mundane and cut through the bureaucratic BS to demystify the world of defense tech. But be warned, this is not a typical government podcast. Ready to get weird?
Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm your host, Tyler Sweatt. Welcome to another episode of All Quiet on the Second Front, the podcast where boring defense talk comes to die. Really excited to sort of dig into one of the larger players in the market, and I think somebody that we've all watched grow and transform relationships between organizations, individuals, and their data. So really excited to have Bryan from Snowflake join us. So thanks for coming by, brother.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. Appreciate you having me.
Heck yeah. So we'll open with a little bit of the more than just kind of what you're doing now, but help folks understand kind of who are you, what's your journey been like, and sort of what are you working on now, and what brings you to the show.
Yeah, of course. Would love to. So I lead the field CTO office at Snowflake today for all of our platforms. So everything from AI, data engineering, security, and so on. But 25 plus years in tech, started right out of high school, actually, in network engineering at Sprint. Spent some time in the basement of the central offices doing network engineering, and then moved into the software side, worked in PubSec for 15 plus years now. Working in GovTech and mainly in the federal side, but some state and local. Was at AWS prior to Snowflake. I led the solution architecture teams globally at AWS for all compute. So big team, big business. And on the side, I'm also a volunteer officer with the Ohio Highway Patrol as well. So I have a fun hobby in addition to my tech day job.
Yeah, that is an interesting hobby. As you've gone Sprint, sort of AWS, into Snowflake, I think the what is the new thing has sort of moved and evolved, and you've been on some of those waves kind of as they're breaking. Uh, Oftentimes folks talk about data like, hey, data is the new oil. And I think that's, every senior leader has a billboard or a slide with that on it somewhere. And I get it, like I get the intent. What's been your experience about like the reality of that and people's ability to not just say it, but to understand and start to harness their data, and maybe even put cleanly, like, are folks really as prepared as we want to think to leverage that data to power some advanced applications and capabilities?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I definitely don't think we're all there today. I mean, it's still a very tough problem to solve, getting the right data to the right application or the right consumer of the data so that the consumer of the data can make an educated decision. We're still in process of doing that, and some of the first projects I did on the federal side were when, we were talking about edge computing and trying to get decision making done like as close to the edge or as far out as possible. And there are use cases where that made a lot of sense. And, we were just doing decision making way out in the battlefield, for example. And now we're starting to see use cases where you need more compute power, where decision making is being more centralized. Certainly AI and Gen AI is an example of that. And to do that well, you really need the right data and a lot of it, and the data that's useful and meaningful to the consumer of your data. So the way we like to explain it at Snowflake is, you have sources of data on one side. And today, those are still very siloed. I mean, sometimes it's dozens of systems, sometimes it's hundreds of places, but you have all this disparate data sitting in all these different places. And then over here, you have consumers of data. When I say consumers, I don't necessarily mean people, although it could certainly be people, but it could also be applications, it could be business intelligence tools, but you have these things. And, getting from point A over here to point B is still a hard problem to solve. And it's really what my team spends a lot of time doing is, Snowflake can sit in the middle and give consumers access to data that sits in all these different silos. But it's still a hard problem to solve, for sure.
How are you seeing folks understanding where those silos even are? I think in my experience, and it's been a mix of, consulting for larger sort of Fortune ones and fives and large governments. I think I always, initially at least, had this idea that like, oh, they're large pharmaceutical company X or very, very important government organization Y. Like they've got to have it together. They've got all of this organized and like they understand how it's tagged and the ontology and everything. And in both of those examples, once I got to the data, I think I was flabbergasted that it felt very much like the 20-person team I was on, where like we sort of had everything tossed in a SharePoint site or a Google Drive. Are you seeing that as well? Or are you seeing maybe an increasing number of folks who are maybe leaning in and more ready to meet you guys as you're coming in with a scale solution?
So I think it's a little bit of both. So definitely customers are realizing, and by the way, Gen AI has been a forcing function on this, that they really don't have a clear view of all of their data. And even if they do, even if they've kind of figured out how to get all their data aggregated, which by the way, I really don't know very many that have done a great job at that yet before we get in there. But even when they do kind of get it all centralized, sometimes they don't know how to get it back out again. So again, it goes to those two parts. But the short answer is that vast majority of organizations, private sector, public sector, don't have a good idea of really where all their data resides. And that's where partners, and consultants and things can come in and be very beneficial in helping locate data. Because sometimes it can be in a laptop. I mean, everybody thinks it's in a mainframe somewhere. I mean, sometimes you've got, one developer that's been building something and it's on their laptop. And I mean, you got to get it out of there. You mentioned SharePoint, PDFs. I mean, it's wild where data can sit, right? We're working with a customer that has data sitting in old paper manuals that they need for doing maintenance. And it literally is in old physical paper. And they're trying to figure out how to get it out of thousands and thousands of pages of physical paper to something that a mechanic halfway around the world can access in real time through a chatbot, for example. And so it's definitely still the start of the journey. Really, it is. We're still at the start of the journey of getting all of the data centralized, searchable, accessible to the people and systems that need it.
As you talk about the start of the journey and some of the different sort of spots along that journey where everybody's starting, right? You've got folks with paper manuals, you got folks where things are sitting on a developer's desktop or on their hard drive. If you're talking to the next cast of founders that are coming out or operating teams at earlier companies, what are some things that they can think about so that as they look 2, 3, 4 years down the road, it might not be perfect, but they're building in a way where we're going to be able to maybe harness more without having to go back and deal with different types of like data debt, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. Yeah, I think getting data centralized, searchable, and accessible is just key. I mean, it really is part of having I think, an intelligent platform to power your business is having data centralized and searchable. Whether it's Snowflake, of course, I'm biased, or another tool, you get the data centralized in a single location and avoid these silos. And again, silos can be many things. I mean, in a big company, it can be an ERP system or, a web sales database for what we're doing on the internet. Or to your point, to a smaller company, it can be a bunch of developers punching away on laptops, building things, but it's still kind of centralized, or not centralized rather. So no matter what, getting that data centralized and accessible to the people and systems that need it, I think is just paramount.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit with that focus on like the organization, on some of those just data principles, some of the things you've seen as the team goes in. Flipping that around and thinking about sort of broader public sector, as you guys, Snowflake, have been making sort of an entrance into the market, continuing to grow. How is it going? Right, I think we've got folks listening that are everything from large, sort of publicly traded primes who are super comfortable with working with the government, down to startups coming in through, an SBIR or a Tradewinds marketplace or something like that. Um, how's it been, sort of bringing in a new capability, delivering that? Does it get easier as you get bigger, like a Snowflake? What's that look like?
Yeah. Well, it certainly gets easier as not only you get bigger, but your name gets out there. You become a more well-known entity. So sure, it helps open doors once your brand is well known. But I think regardless, big company, small company, figure out the thing that you do really well, better than anyone else, and that's your story. I mean, whether you're big or small, and that's one thing that our team, like I run the field CTOs, right? So we're really technical, and even as a subset of that, we're not just surgeons, we're the brain surgeon and the heart surgeon, right? And the orthopedic surgeon. Like my team is very specialized. So when my people on my team go out, I mean, they're talking about their one thing that they do really well, that Snowflake, can do really well. And I think that resonates. And I think, same thing, small company, big company. Once you figure out that thing, right? That thing we do, we nail this, focus on that. Don't spread yourself too thin. Don't try to do everything. We're not trying to do everything, right? We're focusing on the thing that we know that we can do better than anyone else. And I think that's generally a good winning strategy.
Yeah. Have you seen have you seen maybe resistance to the centralization of data, or the democratization of access to data by folks out of concern that maybe, hey, their sort of like political positioning in the organization, or like the dynamic of control, maybe some power,
Hmm.
power dynamic will shift? Have you seen that? And if so, how are you overcoming that? And I'm asking that as like a target, I think, an interesting sort of like Snowflake specific, but also as I think that's an interesting proxy for what a lot of maybe disruptive technologies face coming in, is a little bit of that resistance to change. Oh, if I let go of this, what does that make me, or what does that make my organization? You guys are kind of
Hmm.
right at the cutting edge of that. What's that been like for you guys?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, sometimes it's not a technical challenge as much as it is a political challenge, or just a culture challenge within an organization. So surely sometimes it's like, oh man, I want to run this thing, or I've got this silo, and I've got 20 peers who run their silo, and if we break down the silos, what do
Yep.
I do? So yeah, there's certainly that cultural element, and there's another thing that what mentioned in your question, it made me think that I think is important to point out too, is that there's also definitely a concern about the democratization of data from an access perspective as well. So it's also a concern about, oh man, do I want people to have access to all this data? Right. And that's why we take a lot of time explaining how we do like roles-based access control, and making sure the right data is accessible to the right people, but not the wrong people. So there's, I think, multiple elements to what you just asked for, both technical and just more, cultural concerns about the democratization of data. And by the way, the paradox between security and accessibility always plays out too, right?
Oh
Because
yeah.
you can make something infinitely secure and then nobody ever sees it, or infinitely available and then everybody sees it,
Yep.
and then something in the middle, right, where you have the right roles-based access control, the right security policies, and we think we again fit in that sweet spot where data is accessible, but only to the right people, with, of course, the right security and audit parameters around it to keep it
And
secure.
that equilibrium between, security and accessibility, or speed and like all of that is super challenging, which brings me back to something you said interesting earlier. Just, hey, we focus on this one thing we do well. How do you make sure, especially from sort of that field CTO chair, that the sales teams or the external engagement teams aren't dealing with, mission creep or scope creep, where, hey, look, we can do the thing we're really good at, but I've got to, like, completely flip it on its head and invert maybe some first principles. That tension between
Yeah.
the identity, the what we do, the technical sort of gravitas, and kind of what the customer's asking for, how the customer's asking for it. How are
Mm.
you guys balancing that?
Yeah, that's always a tough one. I mean, we try to put really clear frameworks around things like reference architectures and POCs, and we try to get very specific and myopic on what those architectures look like and what the steps we take to do a POC and the use cases that we will go after in a both a POC but even a customer example. We try to give frameworks. So rather than giving dictatorial or, authoritarian, like do this, don't do this. We like to give people frameworks, kind of work within this framework, work within this reference architecture, provided you don't completely blow this up. We've got some little movement around the edges, but generally that works pretty well. And then I always say we always have a door open to that long tail use case, that outlier that we might not think about, but it might just be the next big thing. And so we always leave a door open. So again, rather than being too dictatorial, we like to give people frameworks with an out, an ejection button if they need to hit it.
Yeah, and I like the notion that, hey, we're not trying to be completely, to use your word, sort of dictatorial of like, hey, this is the box, just go deliver the box, the box, the box. I think that's important, but I also think more times than not, we don't talk about the sort of long tail you alluded to, where regardless how big we get, how excellent sort of our solution is, or how much penetration, there is always going to be the next wave, the next thing, the next sort of, and the way to keep pulse with that is that sort of sensor on the customers and in the market. I think a lot of times there's an organizational cultural desire to say like, hey, stop with the good ideas. The good idea fairy, the good idea fairy. I don't need a new way to build a mousetrap. This mousetrap is perfect. How do you balance that? And how do you think about, not to get into sort of the special sauce, but I think for everybody out there who's struggling with, your normal sort of delivery metrics and your NDRs and your ARR growth and GM and all of that, how do you balance the need for sort of operational excellence and efficiency
Mm.
with an eye towards, hey, what could be next, and how much or how little time should we spend to assess what could be?
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's really critical in, any organization that you have ideally a group of people, but in a small company, it'll collapse, but people between the customer and the product teams. So what I mean by that is in a typical organization, right? Once you get above, being a really small company, you have some salespeople and then you have a product team. And sometimes those two groups don't mesh in a way that's meaningful. And to your point, I think it's really important you start to figure out how to separate signal from noise, right? And start to aggregate and collapse. Well, man, this customer mentioned this. Well, did 7 other customers mention it? Did a customer on the other side of the world mention it too? Because that's where you start to see signal through the noise. And if the sales team, around the world hears it, and the sales team in DC hears it, and there's not an aggregation point, you'll never know that there's signal out there, right? Because they probably don't talk all that much.
Yeah.
So, like a team like ours, we are a global team, right? And so we are that point, that aggregation point, if you will, between all the stuff the salespeople hear about and all the stuff they think is, their customer wants this and this customer wants this, and they say they need this. Well, have we heard that before? Are we starting to pick up signal? Because we will aggregate the signal, we will send it to the product team. We're that glue, if you will, between product and sales. It says, okay, that might be noise, that might be lower on the priority list, but we think these things are the higher priority. Now, in a small company, if you don't have that, you're make sure your salespeople and your product people are talking, right? And as you get bigger, then make sure you have that aggregation point. We're a triage, right? We're a triage team. we're triaging that information from customers back to
You're
the
probably
product team.
triaging both ways too, though,
We
right?
are
We're like,
triaging
the
both ways.
product team's coming up with ideas and they've got their sort of design boards and everything. And you're also helping to triage, like, hey, I hear that and that sounds cool back here, but in these 10 customer environments, that might not work. Here's why.
Yep. Well, yeah, I'm glad you picked that up. I mean, because that is also important. We can take it back to the customers and say, hey, our product teams think this is the next big thing, or this is going to be cool. And they'll laugh at you, or they'll like, yeah, that's that. We're not doing that for 10 years. So yeah, it really is a two-way street, right? Validating what the product team thinks is the next big thing. And then listening to customers and taking that back up to the product team, right? It's definitely two ways.
Yeah. And then last question before we'll sort of turn the corner into final question. So I guess second to last question. Um, dual use has become sort of all the rage. I think everybody talks about it now. You sit in a really interesting role with a tremendously large, wildly successful commercial line of business, a rapidly growing sort of public sector side of it. How do you make sure, and for everybody out there, that balance between right signal and noise? There's a macro sort of signal and noise that's all rolled up, and then there's down and there's, hey, here's signal I'm getting from the Fortune 500. Here's different signal I'm getting from global public sector. How are you balancing that, sort of prioritizing rations, and then making sure that when triage is complete, there's an opportunity to sit down and have kind of a holistic conversation? I
Mm.
think a lot of folks that I've talked to struggle with like a yes and type of customer focus. They feel a tug that it's either or. How are you seeing that? And again, not trying to sort of pry under the hood for the magic ingredients, but you just sit at such an interesting place in the market.
Yeah, we do for sure. And so I think that there's a couple ways of doing it. The way I think about it, because yeah, I sit in a weird spot where I will talk to a startup tech AI company one day, then I'm talking to a huge investment bank. Then I'm talking to like a pharmaceutical company in Asia with all these IP restrictions, and they want to do AI, but it has to be in Korea and it can't ever leave Korea. And then I've got I spent a lot of time on the federal side, both in the US and then some, like Five Eyes countries mainly. And so the way I like to think about Tyler is like, if I Venn diagram out kind of, what is this startup doing and what is this? The first thing that I look for, of course, is the overlap. Is where is that low hanging fruit, like the thing that we can go do or add value to multiple. They might not all overlap, but maybe a few of them do, right? Then we will have these things that have no overlap, but maybe in that sector, they're a massive opportunity, right? Maybe there's not overlap, it's just Fed or even just US Fed. But we know that if we get this right, it's like getting a locomotive up to speed. It's going to take a while, but man, once it's going, it's going to have really big momentum. So I look at it from those two vectors, if you will. Where's the overlap? I call that the low hanging fruit, the things that we know we can go do multiple places. And then where is that one-off maybe use case in one industry, like drug discovery is one, right? Where, it's only really applicable to like one industry, but you also know it's massive market
Yeah,
potential,
huge potential.
right?
Yeah.
So there will be those levers. Like I'm not going to take drug discovery to, banking, but for this industry, if we do this right and we know we can get the right data into their models, it'll be a massive opportunity. So those are the two vectors, if you will, the
That's
overlap in the
awesome.
diagram, and then those massive use cases that if you do it right, they're worth investing in for 2 years, 3 years.
No, and that's a great framework for folks to just be able to think about as they're trying to quickly, balance signal noise, demand, intent, sort of all of that. So last question, last is the structure question. Dude, we had such an interesting conversation. If you could wave a wand and sort of change one thing, and it could be on the customer side, it could be on the market side, it could be on the building businesses side. What's one thing you change and why?
Mm. So, I mean, as cliche as it is, and this is where I'm going to talk about AI a little bit. I think the thing that I would change is If I were running an organization, even let's say, right, I would create an AI team and I would empower them to actually go do stuff. And I would end the era of the committees and the, one person from this team and one person from this team, and they've got competing priorities. And I would probably create a CTO level position, right, direct to the CEO over AI, like that level of position, because to do AI well, like you really need access to the entire organization's data. You need to train a model. I call it micro AI, meaning like you can't just really go out to like publicly available models like ChatGPT and type in all your proprietary intellectual property, or even send it over an API and then you're using that to train their models. Like nobody's doing that. So they're going to kind of have to build their own model and fine tune it. They might do RAG, or they might even tune their own model if they're a big enough organization. But to get access to all the data that you really need, right, to really fine tune a model for we're a big drug company, or we're a big pub sec, and we've got all this data and we need to bring it in. If you're doing that with a committee or with like a stakeholder from all these different groups and they'll have equal power, it just takes a long time, just a really long time. So I would create, yeah, almost like a chief data officer. I don't know, call it whatever you
Yeah.
want,
But like
but it,
an empowered one who could remove barriers
yeah, and
and
budget.
really start to drive. Yeah.
Yeah, budget, decision-making authority, right? Direct to the CEO, like something like that. That's probably the
Yeah.
one big change I would make, because I found it's not the
I like
tech
that.
that's slowing this down, Tyler. You
Yep.
mentioned this before. You brought up a key point. It's culture, politics, and organizational structure. That's the barrier. The tech is there. The tech is really good right now. It really is culture, politics, things like that.
No, I love that. And I think that is it is a reminder too to folks that are maybe doing internal initiatives or changing initiatives that, hey, something in name only isn't going to cut it. It's got to have the authority and it's got to have the ability to deploy, or equally importantly, sometimes not deploy capital at certain problems and initiatives. So,
Yeah.
Brian, this is awesome, man. Thank you for one spending a bunch of time with us and sharing some of the secrets, and then and you guys know, thanks for everything you guys are doing to pull the broader community forward so that we can start taking advantage of things like generative AI and all that at all different sized orgs. So grateful for the time, brother.
Yeah. Thank you, Tyler. I appreciate the time. Great
Like,
combo.
yeah. Thanks, everybody. Cheers.